Hey, hello everyone. Hope you can see me now as well. Welcome to Money and Macro Talks, a show where I invite experts from all sorts of fields, basically so that we can ask them interesting questions, often, and also in this case, about videos that I'm working on for the main channel. And in this case, I was working on a video about the impact of austerity on Britain's economy, which is not doing amazingly at the moment. And I came across this really interesting paper by a professor from UWE Bristol, Joe Michell. And he has an interest in basically all the topics of the channel, that is macroeconomics, economic development, finance as well, but also distribution. And austerity, the macroeconomic impact of austerity fits in all of these topics. And so he wrote this report called The Macroeconomics of Austerity. I read it for my research, thought it was super interesting, and so I figured, hey, let's just invite Joe here on the show so that we can all learn from him a little bit about his research. Before we have him on, I just want to remind all of you that this show is not sponsored, it's made possible by all of the patrons and members. So if you enjoy these episodes, consider joining as a member or patron as well. And then, with that being said, without further ado, let me just bring Joe on as well. And there you go. Now everybody should be able to see Joe. Hey, Joe. Welcome to Money and Macro.
Thank you.
Let me just check if everything is indeed technically working, if everybody can actually see and hear this. Yeah, excellent. It seems to be working, so that is perfect. Then we can get started with the macroeconomics of austerity. So the thing is, Joe, I figured let's just get into it sort of all the way, right away. I just wanted to open by asking you, if we can boil it down, and we're going to go into detail about all of this, so don't worry about explaining it too much. But if we can boil it down, why did austerity fail in the United Kingdom?
Oh, it's a good one. Why did austerity fail? It failed because it produced both macroeconomic and social outcomes, which could, in my view, have been significantly better and which are long lasting. I think now we're living with the legacy of austerity in the sense of crumbling schools, malnourished children, but also perceived, at least, lack of capacity of the government to act in the face of cost of living crisis, the result of the aftermath of the pandemic. Just yesterday, we had a statement from the Prime Minister here in the UK about how, we can manage a little bit of a pay rise for the public sector, but you're never going to get any more, and it's got to come out of other budgets. The news is still full of this stuff about there's no money left. We're broke as a country. And that was the thing they said they were going to fix. 15, 13 years ago, they said, there's no money left. Trust us, we'll fix it. Be a bit of pain, and then we'll be good to go. And here we are 13 years later, and it's worse. The wages haven't recovered to where they were, or basically back where they were 13 years ago. And still we have no money to fix the hospitals and the schools.
So, yeah, because Britain was, I think, one of the best in class, I'd say, with one of the strongest austerity programs, and it was now the first to get into trouble, you could say.
I think it's panned out differently in different places. If you look at Europe and the Eurozone crisis, which struck after the 2008, and the austerity that was imposed on so-called peripheral countries in Europe, particularly Greece, saw much more severe effects than the UK and other peripheral economies in the Eurozone. So I wouldn't say that the UK in some ways, we've suffered most. We GDP per capita was relatively high in the UK in 2008. Relatively now, I think we've kind of dropped down the rankings as other countries have speeded up. But if you compare us to, for example, the USA or Germany on many metrics, not all, they've done a lot better. And I think there are a number of factors. Brexit, of course, messes things up when you want to do a comparative study. We kind of all have to give up at 2016 now, because that's when we had the Brexit referendum, which is another big sort of structural break. But I think, broadly speaking, the UK tried it pretty heavy. They turned on the austerity taps pretty hard, and we are now reliably coming up towards the bottom of a whole bunch of sort of international league tables that you really don't want to be towards the bottom of.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, fair enough. I think I should have said Western Europe, because obviously Southern Europe did way worse than Britain, economically speaking. But what I really liked about your paper, so now we've sort of had the high-level stuff out of the way, in the sense, but let's now try to get to how you got to the conclusion. And what I really liked about your paper is that you take it step by step. It's also a bit of a theoretical paper where you say, you answer some of the more basic questions, like, for example, what is austerity? What is austerity?
Yeah. I think, we probably give a reasonably short answer in the paper, but I do think that the word has become so widely used now sometimes that it has lost meaning. In particular, it can mean either something specific about fiscal policy, government spending being reduced relative to taxation, or taxation being raised relative to government spending. So if you like, the government becoming a contractionary force in macroeconomic terms, less money coming out of the government sector than previously was relative to what it's pulling in. That's the kind of macro definition to do with fiscal policy, tight fiscal policy. Mm-hmm. But it's also become synonymous with cuts, government cuts specifically in the UK.
Spending cuts.
So I think if, for example, the Labour government were to do what it's not currently doing in the UK, at the moment it's pretty closely mirroring the Conservatives on these issues, on fiscal policy, government spending and so on. If it were to say, you know what, we've got an aging population, we've got a cost of living crisis, we really need to put some money into public services. We're going to put an extra 50 billion, 75 billion a year, and we're going to do it by taxing capital gains, wealth income, unearned property, something like that. That's a balanced budget change. You could even do it raising taxes more than the additional spending. I don't think most people in the British economy would think, okay, that's more austerity. They would think, okay, that's different. You see what I mean? So as economists, we kind of mean one thing. We mean fiscal policy. Yeah. We don't so much distinguish hiking taxes versus cutting government spending. But I think to the public, it's, at least in the UK, I don't know about in Europe so much, it's very much associated with the idea of really, serious cuts to government services.
And can this also be because that just happens to be how sort of our European governments interpreted austerity as well? Like, this is actually what they did more. So they were more going on the service cost cutting route than tax increase route.
Exactly. It's what people experienced. In the UK, the mix was about 80% cuts, 20% tax rises. And, this incidentally is difficult for we're all in it for get together and there was no alternative story, because that's a political choice. If you want to argue the debt ratio was too high and there's an issue with bond yields and so on, and I expect we'll come back to that, whether that was really the case or not. Mm-hmm. Okay, you can make that case, but then you have a choice. You can close that deficit by raising taxes, or you can do it by cutting government services. And it was a very clear political choice. And actually there were tax cuts alongside some of those, benefit cuts. So it's a slippery one in some ways. What is austerity? It's something to do with tight fiscal policy, but I think tight fiscal policy directed towards regressive policies, particularly government spending cuts.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Yeah. So indeed, it can be both higher taxes and lower spending, but in the UK it was lower spending. And what was the rationale for it? Like, why did they do this? This is also something you talk about in the paper, whereas I think many others would just, skimp across it, I guess.
Yeah. So the starting point, the rationale that we were given 2010 when George Osborne came into power as Chancellor, David Cameron became the Prime Minister, was public finances. The problem is the debt to GDP ratio is too high. We've run out of money. And this was a real sharp turn because 2008, Gordon Brown, the Labour Prime Minister at the time, was really at the forefront of coordinating a global policy response, which was a fiscal expansion. It was activist government policy to try and cushion the shock and avoid sort of beggar thy neighbor policies where one country does fiscal expansion and the others do it less and try and sort of live off the demand of the expansionary one, to try and get a coordinated response, and it was successful, I think. So it was a full 180-degree turn when Osborne came to power. So the headline story was this one about debt, about the Labour government having spent too much. The Labour government did something incredibly stupid. It still haunts them. The person who left the Treasury left a handwritten note somewhere for the next government to find, saying, "We're sorry, there's no money left." And this person now claims it was a joke. We were being humorous or whatever. But of course, the Conservatives still, whenever you bring up these issues, they say, "Well, look, don't blame us. The Labour government, left us a note saying there's no money left. What were we supposed to do?" So they really, first of all, cemented this idea. They got it absolutely everywhere in the press, regurgitated endlessly on television, on radio, that the Labour government had just spent too much money and there was no money left. You run up the credit card, everybody knows that if you waste money, on frivolous stuff, running up your credit card, then you have to save up again and recover. So these kind of household analogies that we're also familiar with. The problem was, if you took a look at the debt to GDP ratio, it fell under the Labour government. It fell from about 38% to about 36, 37% approximately. There was, of course, a huge jump when 2008 hit, not least because debt to GDP is a ratio. So if your GDP falls substantially, which it does in a big recession and global financial crisis, then even if your debt stock doesn't go up, your debt to GDP ratio rises. But of course, you also get what's called the automatic stabilizers. Unemployment rises, tax revenues fall, unemployment benefits rise. That's absolutely as it should be. They're called automatic stabilizers because they stabilize the economy and they do it automatically. But it means that you get a rising debt to GDP ratio automatically as a recession hits. And they were very good at blaming Labour for that.
Which is weird, right? Because the financial crisis should be blamed. Although I guess you can blame Labour for that, but I'm not sure if if that's the route they chose.
Right. And if you push back a little bit, at least now you get this kind of ex post justification for people who still support austerity, and they will say the UK economy was on an unsustainable trajectory because we had this outsized financial services sector. The City of London was dominating the economy. That was never going to survive. Big credit bubble is always going to hit the UK harder. And I think it's true. Two problems with that is, one, the Conservatives were absolutely fully behind financial deregulation and financial services and the banking industry and so on, if anything more so than the Labour Party. The other is the scale of it. I just don't buy that you get a permanent 5% GDP hit, overnight. Okay, smart people in banks have lost their jobs. I would say, okay, you've got some PhD physicists who could actually do something useful now if you find them something to do rather than, leave them pulling coffees or whatever it is. So that was the kind of background story, was this public finances thing. But then
I think that's interesting because one thing that just pops in my mind, if I come at it from an economist perspective, if the government runs out of money, which, on the one hand, we might say technically that's not possible. But then again, if we would say it does run out of money, what we usually would mean is, oh, okay, interest rates on government bonds were sky high. So was this the case in 2010?
No. I mean, there was a wobble in about 2011 when the bond markets did have a little bit of a kind of jitter. And that was unfortunate. We had a sort of slight inflationary burst, if you remember, around that time, and there was a bit of a wobble in the bond markets. But once the bank really started cutting interest rates to zero, which it did, immediately after the 2008 crisis, then the rest of the yield structure, the interest rates on other instruments, government bonds, corporate bonds, and so on, they track it down. There's a bit of a lag there, but there was no real indicator of, as you say, a more precise problem, unwillingness of bondholders to finance the government, spiraling interest costs or whatever. As you say, that's a much more sensible thing to say than we've run out of money, which is we know is technically untrue, although you can use it sometimes as a kind of shorthand. I would avoid it because I don't think it's a good thing to say. So yeah, it was all this story about the bond market vigilantes are coming, the interest rates are going to go through the roof, we're going to be insolvent. Greece, Zimbabwe, and a bit later Greece came in, of course, because the Greek crisis was subsequent. But
2011.
These kind of comparisons were made of, sort of hyperinflationary cases and currency collapses, as if this was a plausible scenario for the UK at the time, which I really don't think it was. And in hindsight, it looks even more ridiculous, that those kind of claims.
But in the paper, you also go into like, okay, but hey, maybe debt to GDP was still higher than we'd like, the government debt to GDP. But there are actually different ways to go about reducing it. So the way they chose is by heavily cutting spending. But that's really not the only way, and also maybe historically not the most successful one, right?
Right, exactly. So if you accept that you have a problem with the size of the deficit, which even that, as you've already pointed out, takes quite a jump, because okay, what determines the long run trajectory of debt to GDP, debt sustainability, if we want to call it this? It's the rate of interest, the nominal rate of interest on government debt. It's the growth rate. It's the size of the debt stock that you start with, and it's the primary deficit, meaning spending compared to taxation, putting aside interest payments. So it's that combination of things: primary deficit, growth rate, and interest rate. And if you do kind of sensitivity analysis with this kind of stuff, it's a very simple equation. You can play with it. You actually find that it's G and R. It's the interest rates and the growth, which are the things which tend to have more of an effect, because it's like a big ship. It takes a long time to turn around a debt stock, at 80-90% of GDP. And ultimately, the kind of exponential dynamics of growth and interest rates can be more powerful than the primary deficit thing. So there's one question, to even go before: do we need to close the deficit in order to deal with this, or do we need to try and have higher growth or manage interest rates in some way? Mm-hmm. Okay, if we even accept that, there's a problem with the primary deficit, it's 4% and we want it to be 2%, then, as you say, you can choose. Do you want to do it by cutting government spending, or do you want to do it by raising taxes? And in the UK, they went about 80% for government spending cuts and about 20% for tax rises. And the spending cuts were disproportionately leveled towards those at the bottom of the income distribution, precarious people, minorities, and so on. So we can come to the social aspects. This is kind of an economics thing, but the social aspects were really, I think, insidious. You could be cynical, and I am quite cynical, and say, look, this is a political calculation. You can heap the pain onto a relatively small number of people who are never going to vote Conservative. Probably quite a few of them don't even vote themselves. It's not going to hurt us electorally. Much of the population are going to be relatively shielded, at least in the short run. I would argue now that much of the population in the UK now are starting to feel the effects, sort of longer run effects of grinding out the health service, grinding down social care, childcare, and that stuff. But in the short run, I think the pain was relatively narrowly targeted on the specific bit of the population that could least take that pain, which I think is one of the really sort of ethically horrible things about the austerity.
Because when I was doing my own research on this, if I read correctly, and I would love to see myself being corrected on this, but they said like, hey, okay, we're going to cut spending, but actually we're not going to touch the NHS, so we're not going to touch the healthcare system, and we're not going to touch the education system as much, I think, right? We're going to do some other stuff, like maybe local municipalities, I think, were pretty hard hit.
Exactly.
Sort of social kind of structures.
Yeah.
Like sports clubs or the arts, this kind of stuff.
You got it. Yeah, exactly. So that they had protected areas, as you say. Health, education, pensions were protected. Now, what that really meant was no real terms cuts or some kind of continuation of trend. What it's actually fed through to is still under continual underfunding because of with an aging population, with pandemic and so on. You actually need to increase the funding of those things. So it's not as if they've been truly protected, but relatively speaking, they took less of the hit than the other things you said, which meant that things like local government in particular really it was loaded onto, and this kind of stuff, centers for young adults, training, not higher education, university, but sort of vocational training, spaces where people can gather, parks. It really can have, quite, I think, strong social effects, sort of scratching away at the social fabric. And the sort of tension between local councils then and central government, and also tensions within local councils, you can really kind of stir up some kind of pretty unpleasant dynamics.
And what about infrastructure? Because I read there here and there, like, infrastructure also took a pretty big hit. But then when I went into literature that I could find, it was more about sort of these like youth centers. And I think you could almost say that it's read to me as if this stuff was designed by an economist who would say like, oh, well, this social stuff doesn't really matter. Let's just care about the economy. Like, from that perspective, it almost seems as a smart way to go about austerity, like, playing devil's advocate here, like, if you don't care about the social stuff. So maybe there's two questions in there. Like, one is, you say, they hit local councils, but did this also affect infrastructure? Or and then second, I guess, is from an economics perspective, maybe the austerity didn't hurt so much precisely because that is how they constructed it.
Right. So the UK is underinvested in infrastructure for a long time. If you look at capital expenditure as a share of GDP, we're reliably towards the bottom of comparable countries like the G7. And incidentally, Osborne had at the beginning this kind of list of 10 missions for Britain. We mentioned them in the paper. So at the beginning, it was framed in terms of public finances, but also there was a whole bunch of other big problems with the UK. Underinvestment was one. A persistent external deficit, current account deficit was another, and so on. And all of these kind of disappeared into the background as the period continued, and it all became about public finances. So we started off with a problem of low investment, low infrastructure investment. Our transport system has been underfunded and underinvested for decades now. Much of it was privatized in the 80s, and that's been a disaster. I think almost everyone agrees. Bits of it are now coming back into public ownership, but in sort of worst possible way because of bankruptcies. Vulture funds have come in, assets stripped bits of the railways, sold them off, and then eventually the thing collapses and the government has to step in and take the hit. There was a hit to the relatively low level of public investment immediately after 2008. I think it was around about a percentage point of GDP. But from an already pretty low level, you're talking single-digit percentage of GDP, 1 percentage point drop, and then it came back up again, 2 or 3 years later. So it was there, but it wasn't the biggest part of the story, I think, as you say. I mean, it was about current spending, and targeted current spending on areas that they might, you might say as an economist, it's smart, but politically, I think I'd come back to the point that they think they can get away with this because not so many people are directly affected immediately by mental health provision, social care, childcare. I mean, childcare is a big one. It's taken a while for that one to really filter through. But I think there's something to what you say. But we should not forget that it was everything. I mean, if you look at just government spending per person in real terms, it was steadily rising under the Labour government from levels that were too low, and then it drops. There's a really solid structural break in the series. So even the protected stuff wasn't really protected. It was fairly widespread, actually.
Yeah, because I think this is an important point that you're making also in the paper, is you're saying, hey, okay, if you don't invest, even if you don't cut spending in something like healthcare, but your society is aging, you need to be increasing spending. So even if you don't cut spending, you're effectively cutting spending. And I think that was a nice thing for me when I read it, because some of the other research that I did, there was this really interesting sort of blog post by the Financial Times where they went over now how sort of the health infrastructure in the UK is crumbling. Huge queues or wait lists for hospitals, not enough nurses, all of this stuff, and that just didn't click for me, because I read, well, they didn't actually cut spending there, but I thought this was a really important point that you made, like they cut spending effectively by not increasing it.
Right, and we also had a relatively rapidly growing population over that time. Immigration has been relatively high, so even if you have nominal spending, which isn't changing, if your population is growing, then your spending per head is going down. And if your population is both growing and aging, then you sort of get both effects. So I think that the underfunding of the NHS has been a thing over the last 10 years, despite the so-called protected status under austerity.
Hey, and actually, I was monitoring the chat a little bit since we are in a live stream. I definitely want to do some questions at the end, but I saw some interesting ones come by. First of all, some complaints that the frame rate is apparently really low. Well, maybe that's on the Belgian government for not investing in internet infrastructure enough in my house. So I can't do much about it, but as I understand it, the audio is great, and they can still see us even if we are in a few frames per second.
Oh dear. Okay.
But there was some interesting comments, a discussion, I think, and that was about, and I think that's not addressed enough when economists like us speak about austerity. So the discussion in the chat was, can austerity ever be good? Because it sometimes seems like when economists speak about austerity, or many of them, is like never good. But it seems weird, right? Like it seems, can it ever be good? Is there some good austerity as well? Also when it comes to spending cuts, or is it always bad?
I think there's two parts to the question. I mean, there's an older meaning of austerity, which is about reducing unnecessary consumption in order to make space in your productive capacity for things that you regard as more important. And you can go back to Soviet Union or China for examples of this, when they tried to have the Great Leap Forward, for example, tried a huge investment in capital structures, big investment push, and it's done by squeezing consumption with catastrophic consequences in the case of China, and arguably also at times in the Soviet Union. That's a kind of austerity, but it's a different thing. It's not about public finances, globalized financial markets, and so on, but it's about constraining the consumption of the household effectively. Post-war in the UK, there's also what was called austerity, introduced by a Labour government at the same time as the welfare state as we know it, the National Health Service and much of Social Security and so on. But it was about, for example, trying to get people to buy war bonds, cut back on their consumption expenditure. Don't all go rushing out and spending at once because the economy is fragile. We've got high inflation. We need to sort of restructure in the event of the war, in the wake of the war. And I do think that we're going to be thinking along the same lines, whether we like it or not, in the face of climate change. I think what we've just seen now in terms of the supply shock as a result of the war in Ukraine and the reopening of the pandemic is probably a dry run for the kind of thing we're going to see as a result of climate damages. The increasing freak weather effects are going to just take out production of all kinds of things, take out transport. And I do think we're going to have to start thinking in terms of other things that we are consuming that we don't need to consume, and other people who can consume less, because we need to put all of our productive capacity into decarbonization and mitigation. And if you like, that could be a kind of austerity, but it's a very different thing to the kind of thing which we had in the UK from 2010 and in peripheral states in the Eurozone and so on. So can it be a good thing? Maybe, but not the kind that we had. And I wouldn't say it's a good thing, but can it be sometimes unavoidable? Yeah. I mean, if you just can't produce as much as you could because, a tidal wave has taken out half of your nuclear power stations or something, then, what choice do you have? Okay,
excellent. Well, I think that's also just important to sometimes sort of, because sometimes positions can get taken to their extremes, and that's not helpful for a good debate, in my opinion. But okay, one other really interesting part of your paper, I thought, was that you mentioned that Osborne and Cameron actually had an economic justification for how to grow their British economy through their way of austerity, through specifically how they implemented austerity by maybe even targeting the poor a little bit. And I thought that was quite interesting because very often in the public debate, it's always like, hey, it's like if you're a household, you cannot... you have to tighten your belt, so it's the same. And this is something, I also addressed in my video about Italy, where I said that's just stupid to think about a macroeconomy like that. It's too simplified. But that was not the case here, at least not what I got from your paper. Osborne and Cameron had academic advisors, professors that are at least think a lot about macroeconomics. and they had a really interesting strategy to how it should grow. Can you talk a little bit about that, how it should grow the British economy?
Yeah, right. So, broadly speaking, 2010, there were two sort of academic views, let's say academic-ish views on the effects of austerity. On one side, there were Keynesians like myself, who broadly said, what happens with austerity is when you cut government spending relative to taxation, you withdraw demand from the economy. That reduces spending, that reduces incomes. People spend less, then you have falling employment, higher unemployment, and you get a kind of recessionary tendency. And with hindsight, we were wrong. We'll come back to it, but we got it wrong because that wasn't what happened. The other side was, no, you're wrong. When we do these things, when we cut government spending, when we bring down the budget deficit, it's going to be expansionary. We're going to have expansionary austerity. And the way this works is that currently the bond market is concerned and doesn't trust us and thinks that we're going to have an unsustainable dynamics. And as a result, they're staying away from investing in gilts and UK government debt instruments. And that means that the interest rate on government debt is higher than it otherwise would be. Now, if we put in a credible plan in place and they trust us and they know that that's not going to happen, then we get the benefit straight away because then they come back into the bond market. The interest rates come down. Bringing down those interest rates stimulates investment because investment is sensitive to borrowing costs. In the UK, it'll stimulate consumption because everything is built around the housing market, really. So when interest rates come down, people pay less on their mortgages and they've got more cash to spend, and that'll be that'll stimulate the economy. You get almost a Keynesian effect, but as a result of this falling interest rate through confidence in investors, and also you're just going to have generally higher confidence throughout the economy that sort of sensible people are in charge and that there's a sound economic plan. And you can kind of formalize this stuff. There were people like Alesina, Italian economists, many of them, Ardana, who had a series of very influential papers on this idea of expansionary austerity, working through interest rate and confidence channels to stimulate consumption and investment near enough. So those were the two sides. Keynesians saying you're going to get a recession, the expansionary Austerians saying no, you're going to get an expansion, and once the economy is growing again and booming, then you can cut back on the bad stuff. You can pull back the cut, start spending again, and actually it's the quickest way to get back to a growing economy, a well-functioning public sector or whatever. And what I would argue is actually both sides got it wrong because what we saw looked like neither of those two narratives.
Mm-hmm. And there, I think there was just, maybe I'm too early with it, but I just want to show this graph that you sent me, sure. Which was super striking to me because I also didn't expect that. This is what I said at the beginning, that I just wanted to talk to you because your paper was quite eye-opening for me on some aspects of this specific British austerity experiment. I studied the Italian one. This didn't happen in Italy. What happened so I'm just going to show the graph. We're going to look at the employment rate. And what you will see on screen is that actually sort of was fairly stable. And then, the Great Recession came and it dropped. But then after 2010, after austerity, not only did the employment rate bounce back to where it was, it just kept rising. And that is quite remarkable, right? And this is what you were partially talking about, which surprised you as a Keynesian economist, right?
Right, exactly. The sort of standard Keynesian model, which people like I had in my head at the time, kind of see GDP as a function of demand. Higher the demand is, higher GDP is going to be, and employment as fairly directly related to GDP. So when you pull back on demand through austerity, then you're going to generate lower spending, lower income, higher unemployment. You're going to see job losses and kind of recessionary tendencies. After the immediate drop in GDP, we didn't have a recession. We had relatively steady growth. It wasn't spectacular growth, particularly in per capita terms. It was relatively weak, but it was still in line with sort of other G7 economies. Mm-hmm. So our story about an extended depression in the sense of flatlining GDP per head or something didn't come true. And as you said, we saw what looks like from the first chart which we're looking at, spectacular employment boom. And this is the evidence that the proponents of austerity will still point to. They'll say, look, growth was relatively good compared to Germany and the USA. And we had an employment miracle. Employment as a share of working age population reached record levels. We've never seen these levels before in the country. So it didn't fit our story. But what we argue in the paper, and I actually want to say that it's not just me, it's Rob Jump, Natasha Nascimento, and James Medway are also authors, so I don't want to take credit for all the work, as it was a team effort. What we argue is that look beneath the headlines of this so-called employment miracle, and things look a lot less rosy than you would first think.
Okay, and so what's underneath this amazing chart? Like, what's the bad stuff?
Okay, so what's the medicine? I'm actually going to read you a quick quote here, because there's a bit of the expansionary austerity story which was even less well known. I mean, as you say, expansionary austerity as a kind of respectable academic story was not that well known, although the British politicians did openly refer to it, and it was kind of there in our discourse. But it was all about this confidence sort of thing: bond markets, confidence, interest rates. But there's another aspect to the story which was much less visible. Let me just read you the quote. It says, "Consider a fiscal stabilization that relies on cuts to public spending." That's what we got. "A decrease in government employment, in government wages, and in unemployment benefits can have positive effects on the economy because it makes the labor market less tight. Any decrease in these public spending items lowers pressure on the equilibrium wage with positive consequences for the economy." Now, you could spend ages dissecting that, because it's a wonderful mixture of positive and normative, right? Lowering the wage is going to have positive effects on the economy. But what are they saying? What they're basically saying, if you translate that from economist speak into plain English, is if you implement sharp, severe government spending cuts, you will deliver a major shock to labor bargaining power. You will weaken labor at the expense of capital, and that can have positive effects, not least because workers will stop asking for pay rises. And what we argue is actually those guys called it right, effectively.
And that brings us to the second chart, right?
Let's go to that takes us to the second chart,
which is
so in the
weekly
UK,
pay, which flatlined.
In the UK, we have very so-called flexible labor markets. European labor markets are generally more regulated. Contracting length tends to be longer. There tends to be more worker protection. Of course, it varies from country to country. But broadly speaking, we have a flexible labor market, which makes it relatively easy to move in and out of jobs, people to sack you, but also sort of pick up precarious, low-paid work in the margins. And we argue that that's what you see during the post-2010 austerity period. You see a collapse in the real wage, effectively, almost immediately from 2010 onwards. And it has yet to recover. Real weekly average wages in the UK are yet to recover to pre-2008 levels, and are currently predicted by the official forecasters, the OBR and the Bank of England and so on, not to recover to those levels till I forget when, another 2 or 3 years away. So you're looking at 20 years without a pay rise for the average household. So austerity looks very different in those terms. Okay, you've got an employment boom, GDP doesn't look too bad, but most people haven't felt any of those nice charts. They've felt the chart which you're seeing there, the wage cut. There's this story which you may have heard during the Brexit debate. One of the politicians who was trying to argue against Brexit was up in the north of England, when there were sort of former industrial areas which are now, very deprived and sort of left behind areas, and was giving this long story about, you mustn't vote for Brexit, because if you vote for Brexit, your GDP will go flat or it will fall. We've had GDP growth for the last 10, 15 years, and you won't get that anymore. And somebody in the audience puts their hands up and says, no, hold on a minute. That's not our GDP growth. That's your GDP growth. We don't get that. Yeah. And I think there's a lot in that. GDP can hide a lot. So the average household income in the UK didn't see much going on. And I think really what's going on is this story about a severe bargaining power shock forced people just to preserve their incomes, just to keep food on the table, to keep their families fed, keep a roof over their heads, to go out and look for whatever they could. And that meant taking on Deliveroo kind of jobs, food deliveries, pulling coffees. When you dig into the demographics, for example, of the UK labour market, one of the groups which saw the largest expansions in employment over this time was mothers, women with dependent children. Now, arguably, that's the group which least need and want and should be spending 50, 60 hours a week at work. They should be spending time with their family, caring for their family. We argue that much of this is almost forced employment. It's people, unemployment benefits are cut, government jobs are cut, access to decent employment is not expanding. Just to keep things together, people are going out, and the economy is flexible enough to generate these kind of crappy jobs, enough to sort of put a few pennies in people's pockets. And some interesting stuff comes out of this. Not least productivity, because in the UK we have this story about a productivity puzzle. It went absolutely dead flat from 2008 onwards. Productivity growth has been zero, near enough. Actual measured output per hour is completely dead flat. Now, your standard economic story is
more flat than other countries, right?
Yeah, this is the interesting thing, of course, is that many of the trends we're looking at are rich Western economies, at least, are all seeing the kind of stuff, secular stagnation, etc.
Real
but the
wages
UK does
somewhat stagnated, but worse in the UK.
We seem to have done it worse than most places. So I think a lot of what I say actually does apply to other places, because similar policies have been in place elsewhere. But I think we did push it maybe a bit harder in some directions.
Yeah.
So what's the standard economic story about productivity? It says it's to do with technology and it's to do with education levels. It's something intrinsic to your factors of production. Your labor and your capital are combined together. And we've tried for years to measure them and find out what actually generates output with those two things. And there's always a bit we can't measure. We call that productivity. And we say it's something to do with technology and entrepreneurship and these factors of production. What we would argue is actually it's a residual. GDP is largely demand determined, and we had weakish but not catastrophic growth over that period. It was positive 1-2% kind of real terms growth rates. Massive boom in employment, hours worked, and number of people in work and so on.
Yeah.
If you've got broadly flat GDP plus a massive rise in employment, what are you going to get? You're going to get productivity, which is GDP divided by hours worked, output divided by. You can try and bring in capital, but then it gets the aggregation problems get really messy. I think the only meaningful measure of productivity is output per hours or output per week.
Yeah.
What do you expect? Stuff. You're going to get flat lining. You move a big proportion of your workforce into very low productivity, sort of menial type jobs.
But I don't understand this completely. You're saying, hey, it's not actually productivity, it's a residual. Well, that refers to, the residual part of an equation. So it's like, because, how do I explain that in a nice way? But it sounds to me like it is actually also just a problem of, because you say, hey, we're putting people in low productivity jobs and so productivity declines. So I don't understand your comment about it being residual completely.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is at the aggregate level, if you're going to define productivity as output divided by labor, if output stays flat and labor increases, then by definition, you're going to have a fall in productivity. The sort of standard view would be that productivity is embedded in your factors of production. So as you increase use of factors of production, as you raise employment, productivity shouldn't change. Each additional unit of output should work with a unit of capital, and in a Cobb-Douglas production function, you get constant returns to scale kind of thing. What we're kind of saying is that the amount of production and therefore the amount of available income didn't change that much. But people kind of reshuffle, through the labor market, the pie is shared out among a larger number of people. So it looks as if, both wages fall, it looks as if people are less skilled, less educated or whatever. There's sort of intrinsic elements.
But they're just stuck in low productivity jobs.
Say again?
But they're not less educated, so they keep this potential for a bit, but they're just stuck in less productive jobs, is what you're saying?
Right. They're in jobs which don't produce much output, or if maybe don't have, they could have almost like zero marginal productivity. You know, you just add an extra person to the hairdressing shop to do a bit of sweeping up that would have been done by the person who works in the shop anyway. Same number of haircuts get produced, but the labor market finds a way of sort of redistributing income. I mean, it's a slightly extreme case. Part of it is, as you say, the types of jobs that were created, but I think there's almost just a redistribution. You know, you think of it as fixed GDP, more people working, then you've got to share GDP among wages into smaller chunks. So, you know, wages fall.
But what I don't see about that is, like, I understand the story. So you're saying, okay, you're not changing your output that much. You just the labor market is for us reshuffling, sort of creating more jobs with the same output, so lower pay for everybody. But what I don't understand the mechanism there. Like, why would someone in that hair shop like do that? Why would they hire someone extra if they, you know, if that person doesn't do much?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that's a kind of non-profit maximizing kind of idea, right? So I'm trying to give you a slightly edge case, which is too extreme. I think probably it makes more sense to think in sort of aggregate terms of. I mean, there are always bullshit jobs, you know, in the big corporations, and maybe a small hairdresser is not such a good example. If you think in the kind of big corporations, they can, you know, hang on to a few employees even as their demand flatlines. There were new jobs created, of course there were. You know, the number of hours worked did increase, and at the margin, these were 0 hours. They were not good jobs, so we didn't add high tech manufacturing, production, and so on. So, I mean, maybe it's better to think of it in terms of, okay, it's not just purely redistribution for a flat pie. The pie is growing at the margin, but it's growing by smaller amounts, and so the productivity is attached to the job rather than the factor of production. You could think of it in those terms. But I think there's probably an element of both. I mean, I think the flexibility of the UK labour market at the aggregate probably does have some degree of over time. You know, inflation was weak, but, you know, the prices do change. Some people don't notice their income falling a bit, and somebody else can therefore take a little bit along the side by having another nominal income. I think there's an element of different mechanisms at play there, but none of them are the standard neoclassical mechanism, really, of productivity is just embedded in your factors of production, if you see what I mean.
So if we can go back a little bit sort of to the like the broader macro picture, like, hey, okay, we had this austerity. The idea was expensive austerity. So what we're going to do is we're going to create this confidence. We're going to shift people out of the public sector. They have lower wages. There will be more investment in the private sector. Businesses will be booming, and only, like, how I understand it from you is only half of that story came true. Wages went down, but business investment didn't rise, business productivity didn't rise. But, you know, that still sounds a little bit like, oh, hey, austerity had a completely distributional impact on the British economy. That is to say, it made it worse from a distributional perspective, more unequal place, less nice for many people. But on average, it was, you know, maybe not bad for, like, purely from a GDP perspective. Or could it be that it's also bad from a purely GDP perspective, because if you have all of these people in these low productivity jobs, then they are not learning valuable skills, and hence the British economy sort of, you know, will not be on the cutting edge anymore because they're all stuck being a Deliveroo driver, roughly saying. Is there any merit to that, or am I taking it too far?
So what I would say is, when you look at the volume terms, you know, the inflation adjusted GDP per capita charts, we don't have that one with us, but we can kind of imagine it. And you compare, for example, the US, Germany, and the UK, they all take a hit in 2008. The UK's hit is larger, and then the US and Germany come back relatively quickly to sort of where they were in 2008 or thereabouts. And then they sort of resume, you know, mediocre growth, 1.5% per year, per annum. The UK drops 5% ish 2008 and doesn't recover. So if you do a chart from 2010 onwards and you compare US GDP with German and UK GDP, they look as if they're all growing at the same rate. So people say, well, you know, why do you make a fuss? The thing that we argue endlessly about is, was that loss, that 5% loss of GDP in 2008, did it have to be permanent in the UK? Why could the US and Germany and others close that gap, in a year or two? And what the Austerians will actually say now is, well, we had an overblown financial sector. City of London was too big. That was gone. That was out by the time we came in, that was lost. And I just don't buy it. I just don't buy the fact that we had an overnight hit to potential GDP. If demand had been stronger, what they're saying is, let's say we didn't have austerity. We left taxation where it was, but we didn't do the government cuts, or we did the government cuts much less severely. So we had an expansionary fiscal policy. The government's borrowing more. Let's come back to whether the bond vigilantes would have let us get away with it or not. I think they would have done. You would have had higher demand in the economy, higher spending. The question is, could it have accommodated that? Would you have had inflationary pressure straight away because the economy was at full tilt, or would the economy have grown? Would it have made new jobs, but better jobs? And over the longer run, with that sustained higher demand, would it have stimulated business investment? Would you have seen then capacity expansion? Because my view is that business responds to demand. When demand is strong, they build new capacity. So even if in the short run you might get inflationary pressure, it can be a stimulus that leads to capacity in the longer run. I think there was space. I just don't buy the fact that the UK economy had no slack, in 2010. So I think that austerity, as well as the distributional effects that we've been discussing, had straight out GDP costs, fairly substantial ones as well.
So that is like getting back to the poll that I did, was austerity unavoidable in 2010 in the UK? And this is also, coincidentally, my final question to you, right? Like, was higher spending possible? You're saying, I think it is, because that's what we've seen in other countries like the US and like in Germany. Even though Germany talked a big game, I don't think they had the strict austerity that Britain actually did. And the US for sure didn't, right? And they kept growing. And so why couldn't Britain? Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, you take a look at the indicators in the UK. Interest rates were cut to zero. And then the Bank of England enacted on this quantitative easing program. And they were very clear. The reason they were doing it was because their job is to get inflation on target. Inflation for much of the period was below. We were flirting with deflation. It was between 0 and 2. So it was under the target. The bank ever more clearly said, and they're not really allowed to say it because they have a very tight legal remit. But if you read between the lines, they kept saying, we can't get demand up. This is a demand constrained economy. We've done everything we can. We've cut rates to zero. We've, enacted billions of pounds of quantitative easing. Inflation is still below target. That tells us that there's not enough spending relative to productive capacity. And that's because fiscal policy is too tight. And I think it was very clear that policy mix of ultra loose monetary policy and tight fiscal policy was the wrong mix for the UK at the time. It could have grown faster. On the question of would the bond markets have taken it? Again, interest rates were at rock bottom. Real interest rates for most of that period were negative. Investors were willing to see their wealth eroded for the privilege of having a safe asset over that time. And I think one real mistake we didn't make was to lock in long-term borrowing, 10, 15, 20-year gilt issuance over that period at basically negative interest rates. Now we're in actual real trouble because we did all this QE. No one was ever quite sure why we did it. I'm still not sure why we did it. QE is variable rate because QE pays the Bank of England's deposit rate, which is currently 5%. So it reacts instantly to Bank of England rate changes. If we hadn't done that and borrowed in the gilt markets 10, 15%, then now we could have a bank rate at 5%, and the hit to government finances would be negligible because the bonds would just be sitting there paying zero. So I think all the indicators, all the macro indicators you look at for slack in the economy, willingness to finance, all said, fiscal policy is too tight. And I think there was a lot of space to loosen it.
Interest rates were low. It seemed strange to cut spending then, and I think a lot of people agreed with you. Like Even people because like I mentioned, I was doing a bit of research on this, and like even people like Martin Wolf from the FT, who is quite a famous, I think more of a centrist commentator, or maybe before the crisis, I guess even a bit right leaning, who also said like, why the hell are we doing this austerity at this point in time? That just makes no sense with interest rates at rock bottom, unemployment still relatively low, so there just seem, and inflation super low, so it seems to be a strange move. But final question, and then we get to the audience questions. Now it's a different situation, and now there is a lot of inflation in the UK. I think there are some signs that there is a lot of demand in the UK. The current account deficit is very high, meaning that there's lots of imports and not enough exports. And as a consequence, there is a lot of jitters in the bond market, so to say. There are jitters in the market for the pound. So there's talk about austerity again, if I read it correctly. So you are now in favor of austerity.
Not quite, no. But you're right. The situation is very different. We're not in a situation of zero interest rates, situation of relatively high unemployment. We still have high employment and low unemployment, although I think it's much of it is this precarious and low desirability jobs, let's say. But the labor market is tight, and we have got a whole bunch of problems. People leaving the labor market, people who can afford it in their kind of 50s and 60s, people who are lucky enough to have made money in the good times, are finding it so unpleasant to be in work at the moment that they're just giving up and leaving. And many of these are the kind of skilled people that you don't want to see leaving. We've got problems with health in the wake of COVID. There's big sections of the workforce off with health problems, long COVID, mental health. And I think mental health probably comes back to some of the austerity issues. So we have a tight labor market. We have inflation running at about 8.5%. It's coming down everywhere, but it's not coming down as fast as you'd like. And it's coming down more slowly in the UK than almost anywhere else comparable. Spain, Belgium, it's right down sort of 2% near enough in some cases. The US, it's down 5-6%. The UK is looking persistently sticky, 8.5. I don't think we know the reason for that. Brexit is probably part of it, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are technical reasons. There could even be things about contracting length that kind of come out in the wash. But it's clearly a different situation. It's not a situation that you would advocate, in my view, a strong demand stimulus. One question we got to ask ourselves is how much of the pricing shock that we're seeing is imported? How much of it is just a terms of trade shock? Is it just that global price of oil is more expensive relative to UK exports, and therefore there's nothing you can do about it? Versus how much is domestic spending relative to domestic productive capacity, which is something arguably you can do something about. I would say that most of it, I think, still is the global shock, and it's just the fact that the price mechanism and the price system is very complex and it's relatively robust. But when you hit it hard, it does take time to restructure itself. It takes time for all of these shocks to filter through, and you just got to expect that. You've got to expect that the kind of shock we've seen will take time to filter out. It's not necessarily excess domestic demand. That said, I think you can make a case that some indicators do show tight labor markets. There's not much slack, that's for sure. It's not we've got 5% potential GDP that we can immediately fill up with a demand stimulus. Are interest rates the right tool? I would say no, because what do interest rates do? They raise the cost of mortgages for families. Does that help them with the cost of living crisis? No, it doesn't. Does it do anything about global oil prices? No, it doesn't. So I would say fiscal tools are the right tools to use in the current circumstances. What do we want to do? We want to shelter those at the bottom of the income distribution who can't afford food at the moment, can't afford to heat their houses. Some are, fortunately, but when it gets cold again, they're not going to be able to keep their houses warm. And that's going to have to come at the expense of someone else. So I would be in favor of redistributive fiscal policy, effectively, not austerity. Absolutely not cuts in government spending. So that meaning of austerity, I would be absolutely dead against. But I think, you've got to look at balanced budget or even possibly overall contractionary fiscal policy, but you've got to weight it towards those who can really afford it.
So higher taxes for the rich. is what
So
you're
higher
saying.
taxes for the rich, right?
And that is the economic definition of austerity, right? That is also austerity, if not by popular or public opinion, because that's not what we've seen for a long time. But from an economics perspective, I would say you are being consistent and you are arguing for austerity, fiscal austerity in the UK at the moment. But be
Yeah,
it
if
fair.
you want to use the term of government spending versus taxation, or overall spending in the economy, really what we're thinking of is, you give some support to those at the bottom of the distribution who really can't change their consumption. I mean, they spend all their money already on housing, food, and transport. And when they get hit by a cost of living crisis, they eat less, or they walk to work or something. I mean, those people should just be made to be able to continue their already meager lives as best they can by at least being able to afford the food they were eating a year ago or whatever, I would say. If that requires that people cut back on fancy holidays and redoing their kitchens with nice marble worktops or whatever, so be it. We've also got a climate crisis, and all this stuff has carbon emissions. So I've sort of made the point earlier that at some point I do think we're going to need a sort of climate austerity, but austerity in the sense of fewer power yachts and private jets is a very different thing to shutting down the social clubs and not fixing the schools, so all the roofs are falling down and the kids have to go into porta cabins. And I think the public wouldn't see that. If you tell them that both of those things are austerity, I think your average member of the public would say, no, those are different. Making Elon Musk not fly his spaceship so much is not the same thing as failing to fix the school roof.
Okay, I think you've made a very consistent case, compelling case. Hopefully, the audience also found it interesting. What I've done is I've asked them to ask some questions. So I'm just going to look at them now. Let's see if there are some questions that have come up. Oh yeah, okay. Here's an interesting question from Jumbo Zeus, I think, which says, is there any truth to fiscal conservatism during boom and fiscal investment during recession? So that's the classic Keynesian kind of stuff. But I think people often, get a bit frustrated with Keynesians because they feel like, hey, you're always saying more fiscal spending in the bust, but where are you when you're saying, hey, fiscal austerity because it's a boom? So yeah, what do you think of that?
That's a really good question. So one way of thinking about this is that if total spending in the economy, consumption spending plus investment, and by investment I mean a category of expenditure, spending on new infrastructure, spending on new power supplies, this kind of thing, if that amount of spending is not sufficient to generate enough revenue for business that they will hire sufficient people that you have full employment, then there's always a justification for the government to step in and fill that gap. If you've got 5-6% unemployment, then spending isn't high enough. And one thing that Keynes argues is that can be persistent. That's not necessarily always a transitory thing. And I think one distinction here is between how much economists believe that the system is ultimately self-righting, ultimately stabilizing. Now, in that case where you've got high unemployment, weak demand, you could argue, well, then you're in the recession. You should use Keynesian policy. But I think it's possible to argue that capitalism can get itself to a case where it's not just a cyclical thing. It's a persistent, if you have growing wealth inequality, for example, growing income inequality, so that the people at the bottom of the distribution with the highest propensities to consume, the people who spend the majority of their income, have ever lower incomes, and the majority of the income, or more and more of the income, is going to people who won't spend it, you can get these stagnationary tendencies, secular stagnation, this term that Larry Summers popularized. But really, the idea of worsening capital-labor relations, monopolization leading to stagnation, goes back to a very interesting author, Joseph Steindl, who was himself influenced by Kalecki. So I think you can make a very respectable case that demand management is not just for Christmas. It's not just for the business cycle. Against that, I do think you can argue that capitalism is intrinsically cyclical. It is a boom bust system, and with financial liberalization, it's amplified. And you need more of this stuff in the collapses. I mean, you absolutely have to step in the 2008s. If you can get the other stuff right, then ideally the government can step back. I mean, I don't have a problem with the government running a surplus if the economy is growing at 3%, if carbon emissions are 0 and unemployment is 2%. If the primary surplus is 2%, then okay, that GDP ratio can fall. Things are good. But I think we're so far from that situation that it feels to me fantastic that would happen. I genuinely think that. I think the most likely scenario for the next 10 or 20 years is weak growth in the West. I don't think we're going to see strong growth. Repeated supply shocks. We're going to see climate-driven supply shocks. We have to have investment. We have to have green investment, decarbonization. That requires government borrowing. When growth is weak, debt stocks can become a problem. You don't get the erosion of debt that you normally get. So as I said earlier, the rate of interest and the growth rate really are very important determinants of debt dynamics. And once G is weak, particularly if rates are positive in response to supply shocks, I think we're going to see high debt ratios, and we're going to have to find ways to manage them. So,
or
sort of
will
the
we
classic
see higher
two-handed
inflation,
economist answer for you there,
Joe? Or will we see higher inflation for a while, like the permanent higher inflation? Because as we discussed actually before sort of going live, there seems to be a huge shift in thinking, especially coming from the United States, where they seem to have an economy that's running hot, and they're just investing anyway because they're like, hey, China's investing, so we have to invest as well.
I think we're going to see inflationary shocks. We're going to see climate shocks, which are going to generate these kinds of short-run supply shortages and disruptions, and those will feed into the kind of inflationary spikes we've seen.
So that's more of the, just for the people listening, like that's the COVID kind of effect, right? Like how we got inflation from COVID.
Right,
Say,
the COVID
hey,
Ukraine war effect.
Oh yeah, Ukraine war, and now with climate change, we get a lot of that, perhaps.
Right. I think we're going to see increasingly, crops are just going to get wiped out. Productive capacity is going to get destroyed with weather events and so on. And we're just going to have to get used to finding our way through those kind of inflation spikes. And, interest rate policy, treating this as domestic demand versus domestic supply is woefully inadequate. So we're going to have to really fundamentally rethink, I think, that sort of fiscal policy, monetary policy interaction. I'm less worried directly about the idea of sort of running the economy hot, because, I mean, if you look at many of the indicators in the US, employment, investment, they really are moving in the direction you'd want them to see. I mean, I think it's a really interesting experiment, this Biden experiment. And I think in many ways it vindicates what many people have been saying for a long time, which is that you can get away with running economies hot, and it does good things for your economy. Where I worry is on the global geopolitical ramifications. The US issues the dollar. It can pretty much import whatever it wants. It can do green infrastructure on a huge scale by importing all of the precious metals from much poorer countries. When you get an inflationary shock, the US will hike, however, and that really hurts other countries. And the US does kind of use its monetary clout to sort of make its presence felt in those global markets. So I think there are really difficult global distributional and equity questions about the aggressive use of fiscal capacity by the global hegemon, the big power of the system.
So in the past few decades, I think an influential view was that we didn't have enough global demand. But now you're saying, hey, actually, we might be moving towards a regime where there is too much global demand, but it's still going to get the poor countries screwed because it's all coming from the US, and it's all, it leaves them without resources to fight climate change or to cope with climate change.
I think just global demand supply is too simplistic a framework. We're going to have, big areas of the world with insufficient demand alongside, tight commodities markets as a result of US demand, for example. Supply shocks alongside strong demand for, precious metals and so on from the US. So I think we're going to have to start thinking in terms of specific markets almost, which things are expensive, which things have we got supply shortages of. I can almost imagine a world where you can almost have, demand recessions in some countries alongside supply shock dynamics, sort of, a new stagflation, if you like, almost sort of flip side of the kind of 70s stagflation.
So Joe, that is super interesting, but there is a bit of a risk of us, I think, opening up a complete new hour about another insanely interesting subject,
off, aren't we? Yeah.
which is the new sort of economics of the global economy with industrial policy, resource scarcity, inflation maybe coming back permanent. We should definitely talk about that another time, I think.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But it does lead perfectly into the final question that was asked by viewer Jay Patel, who said, what are some specific policy measures you support to reduce non-monetary inflation, like supply chain production issues and the geopolitics that you mentioned? So how can we fix this?
Okay. We got a paper out, actually, almost the same authors, myself, James, and Rob, just on ResearchGate the last week or so. You can find it reasonably easy, where we do make a proposal for the UK, where we say if you cut VAT at the moment, value-added tax, sales tax, it's a sales tax in the UK on things like basic consumption goods. You're doing two things that we want to do. Number one, you're cushioning the blow for those at the bottom of the income distribution who can't afford it. So you're giving a subsidy, effectively, an implicit consumption subsidy. You're also bringing down directly and immediately through a policy tool the measured rate of inflation which the central bank responds to, because CPI, Consumer Price Index, is compiled on the price of goods in shops, and the price of goods in shops already have VAT on them. So although it's a little bit of an artificial mechanism, you're simultaneously subsidizing household consumption and bringing down the measured inflation, and therefore reducing the sort of legal imperative, because the Bank of England has no choice. It has a legally binding mandate to hit 2% inflation target, and when it doesn't hit the target, it's supposed to raise the interest rate. Now, that's going to be overall inflationary, not in the narrow price sense, but in the sense of you're giving more spending power to the economy in a supply shock world. So we argue you've got to offset it with higher taxes on those who can afford it, higher wealth taxes, higher taxes on upper income distributions. That's a pretty narrow policy, but it's the kind of policy that I think we need to be thinking about, in terms of domestic policy. On the bigger questions about global justice, I mean, as you say, we're kind of 1 minute or whatever from the end. That's a big discussion, and it's a very difficult one. I mean, I on that stuff, I would start from things like debt forgiveness. You really want to look at new international resolution mechanisms for liquidity provision. The International Monetary Fund needs to be able to issue new monetary instruments, these things called special drawing rights, to sort of kick cans down the road for countries that are in trouble. And I do think we just need to start looking at, writing off the debts of poorer countries. When you look at the proportion of income spent by poorer countries servicing debts to richer countries, it really does feel criminal. These are the poorest countries in the world, and they're spending huge amounts of their very meager national income, basically sending it overseas to servicing debts. So I think that's where I would start on these much bigger questions of sort of global equity. But as you say, we're way off topic into another realm.
Yes, I think this is a perfect segue into wrapping this up, which was a discussion about austerity in the UK. And also, I think we can conclude that we'll probably talk again about some of these other super interesting topics. Also topics that I will be making videos about on the Money and Macro channel, even though I'm at the moment working on an austerity in the UK type of video, because the UK economic performance is also something that is quite striking. I think I saw all of these charts where people are waiting for hospitals, people are dying earlier in their life again in the UK, it seems, and sort of all sorts of government services are now starting to fail, and I thought that was just something that we needed to know more about, and I am actually more convinced that austerity did play a role in all of this.
There was a new report that came out in the UK just 1 week or 2 weeks ago by a big study of children's heights, and they concluded that children's heights significantly fell during the austerity period. Stunted growth, and the experts said we're convinced that this is an effect of austerity. It's showing up basically in height, which is a proxy for nutrition. We've now got a generation of undernourished children who are not as tall as you would expect them to be.
And what is the motor of future economic growth if it's not the children, right?
Right. So this is where the long run effects of this stuff, I think it's going to be felt for years, decades. So that's where we are.
A sad conclusion. What do you Brits do after such a sad conclusion? And the weekend is about to start. You head into the pub, I think, right?
I would, but actually I have 3 children downstairs who are, very much waiting for me to come and find out about their week in school. So that's the first job for Friday night.
Let's do that. I have a wedding upstairs as well. So then I just want to encourage the audience to after such a bleak sort of conclusion to the stream, please do the pub and enjoy yourself a little bit.
Yes, and life goes on, and we must enjoy ourselves where we can.
And thank you so much all for joining. And Joe, thank